I was holding Dorothy's hand when the monitors started beeping their final warning. 47 years of marriage, and it was ending in room 314 of Cedar Falls General Medical Center. The cancer had taken everything from her except her gentle smile, which she saved for me, even as the morphine dulled her pain. Kevin burst through the door, his expensive cologne cutting through the antiseptic smell, checking his Rolex as if Dorothy's dying was an inconvenience to his schedule. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Dad, how much longer is this going to take?" he whispered, loud enough for Dorothy to hear. "Brittany's got that charity gala tonight, and honestly, Mom's just wasting everyone's time at this point." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Dorothy's eyes fluttered open, meeting mine with a look of such profound sadness that I knew she'd heard every cruel syllable. Her grip on my hand tightened, then slowly relaxed as the machines flatlined. My wife of 47 years was gone, and my son had made her final moments about his social calendar. The autumn wind rattled the windows of our little ranch house on Maple Street as I sat in Dorothy's chair, the one she'd claimed as her reading spot for over 2 decades. The house felt hollow without her humming, without the soft turning of pages, without her asking if I wanted another cup of coffee. Everything smelled faintly of her lavender lotion, a scent that used to comfort me, but now felt like a ghost haunting every room. Kevin and Brittany had left immediately after the funeral, claiming they had important business back in Minneapolis. Important business. The words tasted bitter in my mouth as I remembered Kevin's impatient sighs during Dorothy's final days, the way he'd tap his phone screen while she struggled to speak, how he'd roll his eyes when the nurses explained her medication schedule. For 45 years, I'd tried to raise him right, teaching him respect, kindness, the value of family. Dorothy and I had sacrificed our own dreams, poured every dollar into his education, his wedding, his startup business ventures that never quite panned out. I'd been a high school principal for 35 years, watching thousands of young people grow and change. I'd seen the best and worst of human nature in those hallways, but nothing had prepared me for the casual cruelty my own son displayed toward his dying mother. The boy who once brought Dorothy dandelions from the yard, who cried when his goldfish died, had become a man who viewed his mother's death as an inconvenience to his schedule. The autumn wind rattled the windows of our little ranch house on Maple Street as I sat in Dorothy's chair, the one she'd claimed as her reading spot for over 2 decades. The house felt hollow without her humming, without the soft turning of pages, without her asking if I wanted another cup of coffee. Everything smelled faintly of her lavender lotion, a scent that used to comfort me, but now felt like a ghost haunting every room. Kevin and Brittany had left immediately after the funeral, claiming they had important business back in Minneapolis. Important business. The words tasted bitter in my mouth as I remembered Kevin's impatient sighs during Dorothy's final days, the way he'd tap his phone screen while she struggled to speak, how he'd roll his eyes when the nurses explained her medication schedule. For 45 years, I'd tried to raise him right, teaching him respect, kindness, the value of family. Dorothy and I had sacrificed our own dreams, poured every dollar into his education, his wedding, his startup business ventures that never quite panned out. I'd been a high school principal for 35 years, watching thousands of young people grow and change. I'd seen the best and worst of human nature in those hallways, but nothing had prepared me for the casual cruelty my own son displayed toward his dying mother. The boy who once brought Dorothy dandelions from the yard, who cried when his goldfish died, had become a man who viewed his mother's death as an inconvenience. The September rain drummed against the roof as I opened Dorothy's wooden recipe box, looking for something to occupy my hands. Instead, I found her journal, a simple spiral notebook tucked beneath her collection of handwritten cards from church friends. The cover was worn smooth from her touch, and my name was written on the first page in her careful cursive. For Harry, when you need to remember who you are. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each one filled with her thoughts about Kevin's changing behavior over the years. She'd noticed things I'd missed or chosen to ignore. The way he'd started visiting only when he needed money. How he'd begun treating family gatherings like business meetings, checking his phone constantly, leaving early with manufactured emergencies. She'd written about the time Kevin told her that her stories about growing up during the Depression were irrelevant to modern life, about how he'd laughed when she'd mentioned wanting to travel to Ireland before she got too old. Harry's heart breaks a little more each time Kevin dismisses us, she'd written 6 months before her diagnosis. But Harry won't see it because he loves Kevin so much. Someone needs to protect Harry from this pain. I closed the journal, my chest tight with grief, and something else. Anger. Pure, clean anger that burned away the fog of mourning for just a moment. Dorothy had been protecting me, bearing the weight of Kevin's rejection alone, so I wouldn't have to face the truth about our son.
She died knowing that Kevin saw her as a burden, an obstacle to his busy life. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. Kevin's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I hoped he was calling to apologize, to acknowledge how wrong he'd been at the hospital. Instead, his voice carried the same impatient tone he'd used while Dorothy was dying. "Dad, we need to talk about the house," he said without preamble. "Brittany's been looking at the property values in your neighborhood, and honestly, you're sitting on a gold mine. That house is way too big for just you, and the market's hot right now. We could get you into a nice senior community, something more appropriate for your situation." I gripped the phone tighter, Dorothy's journal still open in my lap. My situation? You know what I mean. You're 72, Dad. You shouldn't be dealing with yard work and maintenance. Brittany found this great place called Sunset Manor. Very reasonable, and they handle everything. You could sell the house, invest the money, maybe even leave something meaningful for your grandchildren someday. The grandchildren Kevin and Brittany had never given us. The grandchildren Dorothy had dreamed about, knitting tiny booties that still sat in her closet. Kevin's casual mention of them felt like salt in an open wound. "I'm not ready to move, Kevin." His sigh carried clearly through the phone. "Dad, Mom's gone. You're holding on to the past. This house is just a building now, and frankly, it's not a smart financial decision to keep it. Brittany and I have been talking, and we think—" "Brittany and you have been talking?" The words came out flat, emotionless. "Don't use that tone with me, Dad. We're trying to help you make rational decisions. Grief makes people do stupid things, and we don't want you making mistakes you'll regret later." I hung up without saying goodbye, the silence of the house rushing back to fill the space where Kevin's voice had been. Through the living room window, I could see Mrs. Henderson next door bringing in her mail. The same routine Dorothy used to follow every afternoon at 3 o'clock. Normal life continuing, while mine felt suspended in amber. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, Dorothy's favorite Earl Grey. As the water heated, I opened her journal again, reading her careful observations about our son's transformation from the loving boy we'd raised to the calculating man who'd inherited her eyes but none of her compassion. On the last page she'd written, dated just 2 weeks before her diagnosis, was a single sentence that made my breath catch. "Harry deserves better than watching Kevin dismantle everything we built together." The kettle whistled, sharp and insistent, pulling me back to the present. I poured the tea, the bergamot scent rising with the steam, and sat at the kitchen table where Dorothy and I had shared breakfast every morning for 4 decades. The chair across from me looked enormous in its emptiness. Kevin wanted to move me into Sunset Manor. He wanted to sell our home, the place where Dorothy had planted rose bushes that still bloomed by the front porch, where she'd taught him to read at this very table. He wanted to erase the physical evidence of our life together so he could convert it into an investment portfolio. I sipped the tea and realized something had shifted inside me. The overwhelming grief was still there, would probably always be there, but underneath it was something harder. Dorothy had protected me from Kevin's indifference while she was alive. Now it was my turn to protect her memory, our home, everything we'd built together.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tomorrow, I would call Margaret Chen. Tonight, I would sit in Dorothy's chair and read her journal cover to cover, learning everything she'd observed about our son that I'd been too blind to see. Kevin thought grief made people do stupid things. He was about to learn that sometimes grief makes people do very smart things indeed. The morning frost on the windshield caught the October sunlight as I drove downtown to Margaret Chen's office. Cedar Falls looked different somehow, as if Dorothy's passing had shifted the entire landscape. The familiar storefronts along Main Street felt like props in a play I no longer understood my role in. I parked in front of the old Riverside building, its red brick facade weathered but dignified, much like myself these days. Margaret Chen's office occupied the 2nd floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked with each step. The waiting area smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, with law books lining every available wall space. When she emerged from her inner office, I was struck by how young she looked, probably Kevin's age, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a firm handshake that reminded me of Dorothy's confidence. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry for your loss," she said, gesturing toward her office. "When you called yesterday, you mentioned concerns about your son's intentions regarding your property." I settled into a leather chair that had seen better decades, Dorothy's journal tucked inside my jacket pocket like a talisman. "My son thinks I should sell my house and move into a retirement facility. He believes I'm too old to make rational decisions on my own." Margaret's pen hovered over her legal pad, her expression neutral but attentive. "Has he filed any formal petitions regarding your competency or attempted to establish guardianship?" "Not yet, but he's persistent, always has been when he wants something." I pulled out Dorothy's journal, its worn cover soft under my fingers. "My wife documented some troubling behavior patterns over the years. Kevin's become increasingly focused on our financial assets, particularly since her diagnosis." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but professional. "Mr. Mitchell, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish? Are you looking to protect your assets, establish clear boundaries with your son, or is there something more specific you have in mind?" I thought about Kevin's voice at Dorothy's deathbed, that casual dismissal of her suffering as a waste of time. I want to make sure my son learns the value of time, particularly when it comes to family. He seems to have forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly. "That's an interesting way to phrase it. Can you be more specific about your goals?" Over the next hour, I explained everything. Kevin's transformation from a loving child to a calculating adult who viewed family relationships through a financial lens. His treatment of Dorothy during her illness, the constant pressure to liquidate assets, his assumption that grief had rendered me incompetent to manage my own affairs. Margaret took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed a sharp legal mind beneath her compassionate demeanor. "There are several approaches we could take," she said finally, setting down her pen. "First, we could establish a comprehensive estate plan that protects your assets from any future challenges. Second, we could create legal structures that make it extremely difficult for anyone to question your competency without substantial evidence. Third, and this might appeal to your sense of justice, we could ensure that any attempts Kevin makes to control your affairs become very time-consuming and expensive for him. The third option resonated with something deep in my chest. What would that look like practically? Margaret's smile held a hint of mischief. Well, if Kevin truly believes you're incompetent, he'll eventually petition the court for guardianship. We can make that process incredibly complex. Multiple medical evaluations, psychological assessments, financial audits, testimony from character witnesses.
Each step requires time, legal fees, and public scrutiny. If he's as impatient as you describe, it might teach him exactly how valuable time really is. I left her office with a thick folder of documents and a plan that felt like justice wrapped in legal terminology. Margaret would begin drafting a new will, establishing a trust that protected the house, and creating what she called defensive legal structures. If Kevin wanted to challenge my competency, he'd discover that the legal system moved at its own pace, not his. That evening, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who'd known our family since Kevin was in elementary school. "Harry, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine concern. "I'm managing, Eleanor. Actually, I was wondering if you'd noticed anything unusual about Kevin's visits over the past few years." There was a long pause. "Harry, honey, I probably shouldn't say anything, but since you asked, Dorothy mentioned to me a few times that Kevin seemed more interested in looking around the house than spending time with you two. Last Christmas, I saw him walking through your backyard with his phone out, taking pictures of everything. At the time, I thought maybe he was just being sentimental, but now it makes more sense," I finished. "Dorothy was worried about you, Harry. She said Kevin had started treating you both like assets to be managed, rather than parents to be loved. I'm sorry if that's painful to hear." After we hung up, I sat in Dorothy's chair and opened her journal to a page I'd bookmarked. Kevin asked me today how much the house was worth. She had written 8 months before her diagnosis. When I told him it wasn't for sale, he laughed and said everything was for sale at the right price. I wanted to remind him that some things have value beyond money, but Harry was so proud when Kevin mentioned his latest promotion that I couldn't bear to dim that light in his eyes. The phone rang again. Kevin's name appeared on the screen, and this time I answered with a different energy than yesterday's grief-stricken confusion. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Brittany found some really detailed information about Sunset Manor, and I think you'll be impressed. They have activities, meal plans, even transportation to medical appointments. It would solve all your problems at once." I didn't realize I had problems that needed solving. "Come on, Dad. You're rattling around in that big house all alone. It's not healthy. And frankly, the maintenance costs are only going to increase as the place gets older. Brittany ran some numbers, and between property taxes, utilities, and upkeep, you're probably spending more per month than a nice apartment would cost." Brittany ran some numbers. I wondered when my daughter-in-law had become the family's financial advisor, especially since she'd never worked a traditional job in her life. "Kevin, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to move. This house has 40 years of memories built into every room. Memories don't pay bills, Dad. And honestly, clinging to the past isn't healthy for anyone. Mom's gone, and you need to accept that and move forward. Staying in that house is just going to make the grieving process longer and more difficult." The casual way he dismissed Dorothy's memory, reducing our shared life to an obstacle to healing, crystallized something cold and hard in my chest. "I'll think about it, Kevin. That's all I'm asking. Oh, and Dad, I might bring someone by next week to give you a preliminary assessment of the house's value, just so we have accurate numbers when you're ready to make a decision." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand. Kevin had already decided my future, had already arranged for appraisers to evaluate the home Dorothy and I had built together. In his mind, my agreement was a formality,
my grief a temporary inconvenience that would eventually bow to his superior logic. I walked through the house, seeing it through Kevin's eyes for the first time. The hardwood floors Dorothy and I had refinished ourselves one summer, the kitchen where she'd taught Kevin to make pancakes, the living room where we'd watched him open Christmas presents for 18 years.
To Kevin, these were square footage and market comparables. To me, they were the architecture of a lifetime. In the basement, I found the box of Kevin's childhood artwork, carefully preserved by Dorothy despite his teenage embarrassment. Crayon drawings of our family, construction paper cards declaring his love for the best mommy and daddy in the world, a Father's Day poem he'd written in 3rd grade about how I was his hero. I sat on the basement steps, surrounded by evidence of the son he used to be, and felt something shift inside me that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. Margaret Chen had given me her business card, with her cell phone number written on the back. "Call me any time if you need to accelerate our timeline," she'd said. I climbed the basement stairs, walked to the kitchen phone, and dialed her number. "Margaret, it's Harry Mitchell. I think we need to accelerate our timeline. Kevin's planning to bring appraisers to my house next week without my permission. He's assuming I'll agree to sell because he believes grief has made me incompetent." Interesting. How would you feel about giving Kevin exactly what he's asking for? I'm not sure I follow. If Kevin believes you're incompetent and he's so concerned about your welfare, perhaps we should let him petition for guardianship. It would give him exactly what he claims to want, the legal responsibility for your care and financial decisions, and it would teach him some valuable lessons about the legal system along the way. I smiled for the first time since Dorothy's funeral. How long does a guardianship proceeding typically take? With the right legal strategy? Months, maybe longer if there are complications. And Kevin would be responsible for all legal fees, court costs, and professional evaluations. Time and money, Mr. Mitchell, the two things your son seems to value most. After we hung up, I walked out to Dorothy's rose garden, where the last blooms of the season were holding on despite the October frost. She'd planted these roses the year Kevin started kindergarten, tending them through every season of his childhood. Now they would outlast her, just as her wisdom would outlast the pain he'd caused. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching my son about the value of time, using the legal system as my classroom and his impatience as his downfall. Dorothy deserved that much justice, and maybe, just maybe, it would remind Kevin of the man she'd raised him to be. The appraiser's business card lay on my kitchen counter like a declaration of war. Kevin had stopped by that Tuesday morning, bringing a stranger in an expensive suit who measured rooms and took photographs without asking my permission. They'd walked through Dorothy's house as if I were already dead, discussing square footage and market trends and voices that carried the assumption of my inevitable surrender. "Dad, this is Brad from Prestige Property Evaluations," Kevin had announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "He's going to give us a realistic assessment of what we're working with here." Brad had nodded at me with the patronizing smile reserved for elderly people presumed to be addled by grief. "Nice place you have here, sir. Great bones, solid foundation. With a little updating, this could really move in today's market." I'd watched them catalog my life like inventory, making notes about Dorothy's antique hutch, discussing whether the original hardwood floors would appeal to modern buyers. Kevin had pointed out the rose garden visible through the kitchen window, mentioning how the backyard size would be attractive to families with children. Neither of them had asked what I wanted or acknowledged that this was still my home. After they left, I called Margaret Chen with an update. "They've escalated their timeline," I told her. "Kevin brought an appraiser to the house this morning without warning." "Perfect." Margaret's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "That actually helps our case. Unauthorized property evaluations could be seen as overreaching, especially if we can document that you never consented to the assessment." "What's our next move?"
"We plant some seeds. I'm going to draft a letter to Kevin expressing your concerns about his behavior. formally requesting that he cease any attempts to manage your affairs without your explicit consent. It'll be professional, but firm, the kind of communication that establishes a paper trail. Will that stop him? Margaret's laugh was knowing. Oh, it'll do the opposite. Men like Kevin interpret boundaries as challenges. He'll probably escalate to filing for emergency guardianship within the month. And when he does, we'll be ready. That afternoon, I drove to Rosie's Diner, a local institution where Dorothy and I had shared countless meals over the decades. The waitresses there had known Kevin since he was a teenager, had watched him grow from a polite boy who always said please and thank you to the impatient man who now tapped his phone screen while others spoke. Linda, the head waitress, poured my coffee without being asked. "How you holding up, Harry? We sure do miss seeing Dorothy in here." "I miss her too." "Linda, can I ask you something? You've watched Kevin grow up. Have you noticed any changes in him over the years?" She glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. "Harry, honey, I probably shouldn't say this, but Dorothy mentioned to me more than once that Kevin had gotten different. Last time he was in here with you both, maybe 6 months ago, he kept checking his watch and sighing like being here was some kind of punishment. Dorothy noticed it too. She looked so sad when he cut dinner short for some business call." "Did she say anything else?" Linda hesitated, then sat down across from me. "She said Kevin used to love coming here because it reminded him of being young. But lately, she said, he acted like your traditions were embarrassing to him. Dorothy was worried that success had changed him into someone who didn't have time for the people who loved him." I thanked Linda and drove home through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the elementary school where Kevin had learned to read, the park where Dorothy had pushed him on swings, the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated his high school graduation. Every landmark held memories of the son he used to be, before ambition and Brittany's influence had transformed him into someone who viewed family history as real estate opportunities. At home, Margaret's letter was waiting in my mailbox, professionally typed on law firm letterhead. The language was precise and unambiguous, requesting that Kevin cease all unauthorized attempts to evaluate, manage, or dispose of my property. It established my mental competency in clear legal terms while expressing disappointment in his recent behavior. I called Kevin's cell phone, listening to it ring 4 times before he answered with his usual impatient tone. "Dad, this isn't a great time. I'm in a meeting with potential buyers for the Morrison count. I received some legal correspondence today that I thought you should know about." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Kevin's voice returned, sharper and more focused. "Legal correspondence about what?" "Apparently, bringing appraisers to my house without permission could be considered overreaching. My attorney thought it was important to establish some boundaries before things get misunderstood." "Your attorney?" Kevin's voice rose slightly. "Dad, what attorney? Why would you need an attorney?" "Margaret Chen. She specializes in elder law and estate planning. Very competent woman. She helped me understand my rights regarding property management and family interference." Another long pause. I could almost hear Kevin's mind racing, calculating the implications of my sudden legal representation. "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just trying to help you explore your options. If you felt like I overstepped, we could have talked about it." "We did talk about it, Kevin."
"You told me that memories don't pay bills and that clinging to the past wasn't healthy. You brought a stranger into Dorothy's house to calculate its value while I was still grieving her loss. I think I understood your position quite clearly. Look, maybe I could have handled things more sensitively, but Dad, you have to admit that some of your recent decisions haven't been entirely rational. Keeping that big house, refusing to consider practical alternatives, hiring an attorney because you're upset about a simple property assessment. These aren't the actions of someone thinking clearly." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Kevin had just provided Margaret with exactly the ammunition she'd predicted he would supply. "Are you questioning my mental competency, Kevin?" I'm questioning your judgment. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I sit, it sounds like you believe grief has impaired my ability to make rational decisions about my own life and property. Kevin's response came quickly. Too quickly for careful consideration. Maybe it has, Dad. Maybe someone who cared about your welfare should step in and help you make better choices. I hung up without saying goodbye, my heart pounding, not with anger, but with something closer to satisfaction. Kevin had just threatened to pursue guardianship exactly as Margaret had predicted he would. More importantly, he'd done it over a recorded phone line that I had been instructed to activate before making the call. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Brittany's name appeared on the screen, which meant Kevin had immediately called his wife to strategize. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message with growing amazement at its tone of manufactured concern. "Hi, Harry. It's Brittany. Kevin told me about your conversation, and I'm really worried about you. Hiring attorneys and making accusations doesn't sound like the Harry we know and love. I think maybe the stress of losing Dorothy is affecting your thinking more than you realize. Kevin and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider some professional help. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because grief can cloud judgment sometimes, and people who love you should step in when that happens. Call me back when you get this. We're here for you." Professional help. Legal guardianship wrapped in the language of family concern. I saved the voicemail and immediately forwarded it to Margaret's office, along with a detailed summary of my conversation with Kevin. She called back within an hour. "Mr. Mitchell, they're moving faster than I expected. That voicemail from Brittany is particularly interesting because it establishes their intent to pursue guardianship while attempting to create a record of your alleged incompetency. How long before they file the petition? Based on their urgency about the house sale, I'd guess within 2 weeks. Kevin strikes me as someone who doesn't like obstacles, and you've become a significant obstacle to his plans. What happens when they file?" Margaret's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess player who'd anticipated her opponent's moves. Then the real education begins. Court-ordered psychological evaluations, financial competency assessments, testimony from character witnesses, review of medical records, depositions from family members, and a comprehensive investigation into whether guardianship is actually necessary. Each step takes time, requires legal representation, and costs money. Kevin's about to discover that the legal system doesn't operate on his timeline. That evening, I sat in Dorothy's garden as the October sun set behind the maple trees we'd planted when Kevin was born. The roses were finally surrendering to the season, their petals scattered across the mulch like fallen prayers. Tomorrow, Margaret would begin filing the protective documents that would make Kevin's guardianship petition as complicated and time-consuming as legally possible. Kevin wanted to teach me about the value of time by forcing me to abandon the life Dorothy and I had built together.
Instead, he was about to learn that time wasn't a commodity to be spent carelessly, especially when dealing with people who'd spent decades learning patience. The legal system would become my classroom, and my impatience would be my teacher. I picked up one of Dorothy's fallen rose petals, its edges brown but its center still soft with color. Kevin had forgotten who raised him, forgotten the values Dorothy and I had tried to instill during those 18 years under our roof. But remembering was a choice, and teaching was sometimes an act of love disguised as consequences. The guardianship petition arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope. I thanked him politely and closed the door, then sat at my kitchen table to read the document that would change everything. Kevin's signature was bold at the bottom, accompanied by Brittany's smaller script as a supporting witness. The language was clinical and devastating. Petitioner respectfully requests the court find that Harold Mitchell, age 72, lacks the mental capacity to manage his personal and financial affairs due to age-related cognitive decline exacerbated by grief over his wife's recent death. The petition detailed my erratic behavior, including hiring an attorney without apparent cause, refusing reasonable housing alternatives, and making irrational emotional decisions about property management. I called Margaret immediately. They filed faster than you predicted. Desperation makes people sloppy, she replied. I've already received my copy from the court clerk. Kevin's attorney rushed this through without doing proper due diligence. There are several procedural errors that will cost them time and money to correct. What kind of errors? They failed to provide adequate notice to all interested parties, didn't include required medical documentation, and made several claims about your mental state without supporting evidence. The judge will likely order a continuance for them to cure these defects, which means more delays and additional legal fees. Reading through the petition felt like watching strangers describe a fictional character who happened to share my name. According to Kevin's version of events, I was a confused elderly man clinging to an oversized house because I couldn't accept reality. My hiring of an attorney was presented as evidence of paranoid thinking. My refusal to sell the house described as stubborn denial of practical necessity. The most painful section detailed Dorothy's death, describing Kevin as a concerned son trying to help his father through a difficult transition, while portraying me as resistant to family support and professional guidance. There was no mention of his callous behavior at the hospital, no acknowledgement of his wasting time comment, no recognition that his version of help felt more like hostile acquisition. That afternoon, Dr. Patricia Hernandez arrived for the court-ordered psychological evaluation. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a manner that put me immediately at ease. We sat in Dorothy's living room, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated memories, while she asked questions designed to assess my mental competency. Can you tell me what day it is, Mr. Mitchell? Tuesday, November 14th, 2024. Partly cloudy, temperature around 45 degrees. And you're here because my son believes grief has made me incapable of managing my own affairs. Dr. Hernandez smiled. That's quite detailed. Can you walk me through your daily routine? I described my mornings reading Dorothy's journal with coffee, my afternoon walks through the neighborhood, my evenings cooking simple meals and watching the news. I explained my financial management system, my medication schedule, my social connections through church and neighbors. She took notes while I talked, occasionally asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to test my memory and reasoning abilities. Your son's petition mentions that you've been making irrational decisions about your housing situation. Can you tell me what makes you think that staying in this house is the best way to manage your living circumstances?
Can you help me understand your perspective on that? Kevin believes I should sell this house and move into a retirement facility called Sunset Manor. His reasoning is primarily financial, though he frames it as concern for my welfare. I prefer to remain in the home I shared with my wife, surrounded by our memories and established routines. I fail to see how that constitutes irrational thinking. Has anyone discussed alternatives with you? Perhaps modifications to make the house safer or additional support services that would allow you to age in place? Kevin hasn't mentioned any alternatives. His focus has been exclusively on selling the property and relocating me to institutional care. When I expressed reluctance, he interpreted that as evidence of cognitive impairment rather than personal preference. Dr. Hernandez spent 2 hours with me, administering cognitive tests, discussing my grief process, and exploring my understanding of the legal proceedings. Her questions were thorough but respectful, treating me as a competent adult rather than a problem to be solved. When she finished, she seemed genuinely surprised by something. Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, based on your son's petition, I was expecting to meet someone significantly more impaired than you obviously are.
Your cognitive function appears entirely normal, your emotional processing of grief seems healthy, and your decision-making shows clear reasoning. I'm curious about the disconnect between your son's description and your actual presentation. Perhaps Kevin sees what he needs to see in order to justify the outcome he wants. She nodded thoughtfully. That's a very insightful observation. Later that week, Kevin called with barely contained frustration. "Dad, what did you tell that psychologist? She spent way more time here than necessary, and some of her questions seemed designed to make me look bad." "I told her the truth, Kevin. About Dorothy's death, about your behavior at the hospital, about your pressure to sell the house. She asked specifically about your concern for my welfare, so I gave her specific examples of how that concern has manifested." The silence stretched long enough for me to picture Kevin's face reddening. "What examples?" "Your comment about Dorothy wasting everyone's time while she was dying, your decision to bring appraisers to the house without my permission, your assumption that grief had made me incompetent to manage my own affairs. Dr. Hernandez found those details quite illuminating." "You're twisting everything, Dad. I was trying to help you face reality, not hurt you. If you can't see the difference, that's actually more evidence that you need help making decisions." "The court will decide what kind of help I need, Kevin. In the meantime, I understand there's been some delay in your petition due to procedural issues." Another pause. "My attorney says there were some technical problems with the filing, nothing serious, just paperwork that needs to be corrected. It'll add a few weeks to the process, but the outcome won't change." After he hung up, I walked to Dorothy's rose garden, now dormant for the winter but still holding the promise of spring renewal. Margaret had called earlier with an update on Kevin's mounting legal expenses. The procedural errors would require refiling, additional documentation, and another round of evaluations. His attorney's fees were accumulating quickly, especially since the firm specialized in complex family law cases. Kevin spending roughly $3,000 a week on legal fees, emergency petitions, expedited filings, expert witness preparations, and court appearances all carry premium charges. By the time this process concludes, he'll have invested enough money to cover your household expenses for several years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Kevin's concern about my financial management was costing him more than my actual expenses. His urgency to access my assets was depleting his own resources at an alarming rate. The legal system was teaching him exactly what Dorothy and I had tried to instill during his childhood, that patience and respect were more valuable than immediate gratification. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Brittany stood on my doorstep, her usual confidence replaced by something closer to desperation. Her designer coat couldn't hide the strain around her eyes, and her voice carried none of its typical cheerful manipulation. "Harry, we need to talk. This whole legal thing has gotten out of hand, and I think there's been a massive misunderstanding." I invited her in, curious about what Kevin had sent her to accomplish. She perched on the edge of Dorothy's favorite chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Kevin's really stressed about all this court stuff. The lawyers are saying it could take months to resolve, and honestly, the fees are getting pretty overwhelming. Maybe we could work something out privately, just between family." "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" "Well, you obviously don't want to move right now, and that's totally understandable. What if we just helped you with some of the bigger expenses? Property taxes, major repairs, that kind of thing. Kevin could take care of the financial stress while you keep living here. Everybody wins." I studied her face, seeing calculation behind the forced concern. "And in exchange?" "Nothing major. Maybe just some paperwork that would make it easier for Kevin to help with bills and maintenance. You'd still live here, still make all the important decisions, but you wouldn't have to worry about the business side of things." Power of attorney. She was asking for voluntary surrender of financial control wrapped in the language of family assistance. Kevin had sent his wife to accomplish through manipulation what the courts might deny him through proper legal channels. "That's a generous offer, Brittany. I'll need to discuss it with my attorney before making any decisions."
Her smile faltered. Harry, lawyers just complicate things and make everything more expensive. This is family business. We should be able to work it out ourselves. The court disagrees. Until the guardianship petition is resolved, all my financial decisions will be subject to legal scrutiny. I'm sure you understand. After Brittany left, I called Margaret with a full report of the conversation. Her laughter was sharp and knowing. They're panicking. Kevin's probably burning through his savings faster than he expected, and now they're trying to bypass the legal system entirely. This actually helps our case because it demonstrates that their concern isn't really about your competency. It's about gaining control of your assets. I hung up and returned to Dorothy's journal, reading her careful observations about Kevin's transformation from the loving boy we'd raised to the calculating man who now saw family relationships as business transactions. Tomorrow would bring another day of legal proceedings, another opportunity for Kevin to learn that time and respect couldn't be purchased or litigated, only earned through patience and genuine care. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, 40 years of memories embedded in every board and nail. Kevin could continue his legal assault, but he was fighting the wrong battle. This wasn't about competency or property values or financial management. This was about remembering who we used to be to each other and whether love could survive the corrosive effects of greed and impatience. The final hearing took place on a gray December morning. The courthouse steps slick with ice that reminded me of Dorothy's last winter. I wore my best suit, the navy one she'd helped me pick out for Kevin's wedding 8 years ago, when we still believed marriage might soften his edges and bring grandchildren into our lives. Margaret met me in the lobby, her briefcase thick with documentation that told the story of the past 3 months. "How are you feeling, Harry?" "Ready," I said, and meant it. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, wood-paneled and formal, with fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh relief. Kevin sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a thin man whose expensive suit couldn't disguise his obvious discomfort with the case he'd been hired to argue.
Brittany occupied the first row behind them, her designer handbag clutched like armor. Judge Patricia Kowalski entered with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd heard every family dispute imaginable. She reviewed the file for several minutes before looking up, her gaze moving between Kevin and me with practiced neutrality. "This is a petition for guardianship filed by Kevin Mitchell regarding his father, Harold Mitchell. I've reviewed the psychological evaluations, financial assessments, and testimony from character witnesses. I have some questions before we proceed." Kevin's attorney stood. "Your Honor, the petitioner respectfully maintains that his father's recent behavior demonstrates a pattern of poor judgment that poses risks to his welfare and financial security." Judge Kowalski nodded, then turned to me. "Mr. Mitchell, can you explain why you hired an attorney in response to your son's concerns about your living situation?" I stood, feeling Dorothy's wedding ring in my pocket where I'd carried it since her funeral. "Your Honor, my son brought strangers into my home to evaluate its worth without my permission. He pressured me to sell the house where my wife and I lived for 40 years based on his assumption that grief had impaired my judgment. When I sought legal advice about my rights, he interpreted that as evidence of incompetence." "And what is your position regarding your son's petition?" "I believe Kevin has confused his desire to control my assets with concern for my welfare. The legal process has cost him approximately $15,000 in attorney fees, court costs, and evaluation expenses. He's learned that time is valuable when it's his own being consumed." Kevin's face reddened at this last comment, but Judge Kowalski's expression remained neutral. Dr. Hernandez was called to testify about her evaluation. She spoke clearly and professionally about my cognitive function, emotional stability, and decision-making capacity. "Mr. Harold Mitchell presents no evidence of cognitive impairment, dementia, or inability to manage his affairs. His grief over his wife's death appears to be processing normally, and his resistance to unwanted housing changes reflects personal preference rather than irrational thinking."
Margaret then presented recordings of Kevin's phone calls, including his threat to pursue guardianship, and Brittany's voicemail about, quote, professional help. The judge listened to Kevin's voice, dismissing Dorothy's suffering as wasting everyone's time, with an expression that grew increasingly stern. When Kevin was called to testify, his composure finally cracked. Your Honor, my father is 72 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for him, refusing reasonable alternatives because he can't accept that my mother is gone. Someone needs to make practical decisions for his own good. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Kowalski said, did you ever discuss alternatives to selling the house? Home modifications, cleaning services, meal delivery, or other support that might allow your father to remain in his home safely? Kevin hesitated. We talked about senior living communities that would handle all those things professionally. That's not what I asked. Did you explore ways to help your father remain in his home if that was his preference? I don't think staying there is realistic, but did you explore it? The silence stretched uncomfortably. No, Your Honor. Judge Kowalski made notes, then looked directly at Kevin. Mr. Mitchell, I'm troubled by the evidence presented today. The recordings suggest your primary motivation is gaining control of your father's assets rather than ensuring his welfare. Your failure to explore alternatives to institutionalization, combined with your father's clear cognitive competency, raises serious questions about the legitimacy of this petition. Kevin's attorney attempted damage control. Your Honor, our client's concern stems from genuine worry about his father's isolation and financial vulnerability. Yet your client brought property appraisers to his father's home without permission and made statements about his mother wasting time while dying.
These actions suggest priorities other than compassionate care. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The guardianship petition was denied completely, with Kevin ordered to pay all court costs and legal fees. More significantly, she issued a restraining order preventing Kevin from taking any further legal action regarding my competency or property without clear evidence of actual incapacity. As the gavel fell, I saw Kevin's shoulders sag with the weight of defeat and debt. 3 months of legal battles had cost him nearly $20,000, strained his marriage, and accomplished nothing except demonstrating his own character deficiencies in public record. Outside the courthouse, Kevin approached me with something that might have been remorse. Dad, I never wanted it to come to this. What did you want, Kevin? He struggled for words, perhaps recognizing for the first time that his answer would reveal everything. I wanted to help you. Help me what? Abandon the home where your mother died? Forget 40 years of memories because they're inconvenient to your timeline? You wanted to help yourself to my assets, Kevin. The court just confirmed what I already knew. Brittany appeared at his side, her face pale. Harry, maybe we could all just start over, put this behind us? You're welcome to start over any time you choose, but you'll do it without access to my home, my finances, or my trust. Those have to be earned back, not demanded through legal proceedings. I walked away, leaving them standing on the courthouse steps, finally understanding that time wasn't something they could purchase or steal, only something they'd wasted. That evening, Margaret and I celebrated with coffee at Rosie's Diner, where Linda served us pie and congratulations. So what happens now? Margaret asked. Now I figure out what the rest of my life looks like. Kevin learned his lesson about the value of time, but I learned something too. Dorothy's been gone for 4 months, and I've spent most of that time fighting instead of healing. Margaret nodded. The house is legally protected now. No one can force you to sell it or question your competency without meeting a much higher legal standard. You've bought yourself the time to grieve properly and decide your own future. I drove home through Cedar Falls, past the familiar landmarks that had witnessed Kevin's childhood and our family's gradual dissolution. The house welcomed me with its familiar creaks and the scent of Dorothy's lavender sachets, still tucked in closet corners. In Dorothy's chair, I opened her journal one final time, reading her last entry. Harry will be fine without me.
He's stronger than he knows and kinder than anyone deserves. I hope he remembers that love isn't about controlling people. It's about trusting them to make their own choices, even when those choices are different than what we'd prefer. I closed the journal and picked up the phone to call Mrs. Henderson next door. Tomorrow, I would start the process of truly healing, of building the life that honored Dorothy's memory without being trapped by grief. Kevin could begin rebuilding his relationship with me anytime he chose to approach it with humility instead of litigation. The legal battle was over, but the more important work of forgiveness and renewal was just beginning. Dorothy had been right, as usual. Love meant trusting people to make their own choices, and I was finally ready to choose moving forward instead of just holding on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.